There was a good 5, 6 years there where I would spend 2 months of the year in Japan studying bluefin tunas for the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and then spend the next 10 months trying to find my voice and make sculptures and print works in my studio in Santa Cruz. So I've been between these worlds for quite a while and very lucky to still be getting after it.
Hey folks, welcome to the latest episode of the Ecosystem Member Podcast. Our guest this week is marine scientist turned artist Ethan Estess, who has brought together art and science to create a pretty incredible interdisciplinary practice. I'm sure many of you have seen Ethan's work before, either on the walls at the Outer Known store in Marin, at the US Open of Surfing, on the Instagram of musician Jack Johnson, or maybe it was at the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. He uses reclaimed materials like fishing nets and golf balls collected from coastal areas to make amazing art with a meaningful story to tell. In this episode, we talk about the responsibility Ethan feels being part of planet Earth, the origin story of the art he now creates, and how art can be a disarming element to an often tense conversation around conservation and environmental protection. Ethan is also just a really genuine dude who loves our oceans and wants to share that love with the world. I think you'll really enjoy our chat. A little bit of a bummer is that this episode, despite its epicness, is audio only. I actually recorded it before our previous video episode with Bodhi Patil, and I made some mistakes in the setup to get optimal video, but we should be back with another full video episode shortly. However, Ethan was completely prepared, and his video looked great, so please make sure to check out Ecosystem Member on Instagram or the short section on our YouTube channel to see some video clips from our conversation. Without further delay, here's the latest episode of the Ecosystem Member Podcast with artist Ethan Estess. Today on the Ecosystem Member Podcast, we are really excited to have Ethan Estess. Ethan, thanks for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
So the reason I invited you on is you bridge two really interesting worlds when we think about nature. So you're both an artist and you're a scientist. You've written academic papers on research on bluefin tuna. I know you've done research in Japan, all over the world. You've also created amazing art that's been exhibited all over the world. So places like the US Open of Surfing and the Getty Museum. So with that context, how do you think about your relationship with nature and the more than human world, or maybe specifically for you, the ocean?
Thanks, Rick. That's a great question. And I think the title of your podcast, Ecosystem Member, is spot on. We often like to think of ourselves as like the dominant species on this planet, but if I've learned anything from working as a scientist, there's no divide. Yeah, maybe are the dominant species on the planet, but that means we're like essentially the dominant evolutionary force. We're controlling which species proliferate and how they're distributed around the world. So there's so much responsibility that comes with being a human. And I think that that's how I feel these days. Having had a couple of kids recently, I feel strongly that the decisions that I make in terms of role modeling and decisions I make in my community in terms of being an activist and getting political, I think that all has ripple effects in terms of the world my kids will inherit. So I feel more than ever like a member of the global ecosystem and not just somebody who wants to take from it, but leave it better.
I love that. It's really interesting because almost everyone I've talked to on the podcast, they have a few years under their belt and experience doing what they're doing. And when they look back, everything makes sense. And from my own experience, when actually in it, it makes less sense and it's less clear, like exactly how they got to the world today. So to unpack a little bit of your background, you went to Stanford, you studied ecology and oceanography, mechanical engineering, and studio art. Interesting combination, to say the least, of classes. So looking at what you do now, combining sort of that art and science in your artwork, and maybe explain a little bit about your approach to your art. Like, what is the story there? How did all those pieces come together to make sense looking back on it?
Thanks. That's a cool question. And it's funny, I talk to a lot of college kids. I just give guest lectures a bunch and stuff. And I always almost feel guilty at the end of the talk because I'll talk about my background, and I sometimes maybe present things as if it was a straight line, like, oh, my background as a scientist perfectly teed me up to be this environmental artist. But the whole time I was just panicking. I was just like lost and like nervous. And I'm really lucky that it kind of became a career and something I still love to do. But it was not a straight line, right? I did study this really broad interdisciplinary program at Stanford, and I was really lucky for that because it did tee me up to have this kind of interdisciplinary life. I'm not working actively as a scientist right now. That kind of dried up during the pandemic for me. I'm full time in the arts, but yeah, there's a good 5, 6 years there where I would spend 2 months of the year in Japan studying bluefin tunas for the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and then spend the next 10 months trying to find my voice and make sculptures and print works in my studio in Santa Cruz. So I've been between these worlds for quite a while and very lucky to still be getting after it. Stanford was really lucky, right? It's an incredible school, but nobody really uses the art department. So I kind of found that people are there for computer science and stuff, right? So I was like, there's nobody using this entire wood shop. Like, you mean I can build a giant 20-foot long pelican sculpture in here that's kinetic and reclaimed? And nobody said no. Um, that's the kind of experience I had there. It teed me up to do what I do in my, adult life.
I saw a really interesting interview with you where you talked about being in Japan, doing that research, and you had some free time. The waves, I think you said, weren't quite surfable at that moment in time, so you went to temples, and that helped you create this idea for the art you're doing now. Which the short version of it is that you're using reclaimed materials, ocean trash, to create these amazing pieces of art, which you've partnered with Jack Johnson, with Outer Known, with with these exhibitions that I mentioned earlier in the podcast. So can you talk a little bit about that story, about how literally these two worlds of science research and art kind of merged together to create this idea for the artwork you're doing now, and you're now fully invested in?
Yeah, man. Thank you. You've done your research. That's exactly how it happened for me. I call it creative tension, right? So when I was working as a biologist in Japan, I it's not that I didn't want to be there. I just knew that my heart was in my studio back in California. I just wanted to be making art. And nonetheless, I was, getting paid to work and travel, so it was a really good gig, and I wouldn't trade it for the world because in hindsight, being kind of stuck in random little fishing villages, often not with much to do, um, it just gave me time to percolate on ideas and open my eyes to new stimulus. So yeah, being bored, walking around at temples, stumbling upon a wood carving that I really thought was simple and elegant. It was this the way, it was just a representation of water, and it just hit me like a Mack truck. I'm like, those lines could be made from the lines I was just looking at on the beach, the old rope that was washed up. And I just knew it was going to work. It was just like a really clear moment of connection to an idea. And I never would have had that if I wasn't out of my comfort zone, kind of doing something I didn't really want to be doing. Um, and that's how it works, right? Like, if you just stay in your comfort zone all the time, you're not going to have ideas that shake you up. And that's what happened for me. That piece that I came up with, this Japanese representation of water, yeah, a year later, I had it in an art show at the United Nations Environment Conference on plastic pollution. And it turned out that Jack Johnson had, and his wife Kim had, my understanding is they had funded the art exhibit to happen at the conference because he's a UN Environment Ambassador. And so the curator sends me a picture with Jack standing in front of my piece, and I'm like, and they're like, "Hey, Jack Johnson really loves your art." I'm like, "That's cool. He can have it," because like he sprung for this whole exhibit, and he's Jack Johnson. He's like my hero. So they followed up and said, "Hey, Ethan, that's so sweet of you. Thanks a bunch. Let's catch up sometime. We're going to Japan right now to play a concert. but when we get back, let's connect. And I said, well, that's funny. I'm actually going to Japan like right now too. And so they're like, okay, cool. Like, come meet us at this festival and come backstage and hang out. And so my wife and I went backstage and met Jack for the first time and hung out with him and his whole family backstage at a festival in Japan and listened to Bob Dylan. And it was just a surreal experience that led to like a really good friendship with them and a lot of cool projects in between. So, uh, this one little idea I had snowballed and went in this crazy way to essentially helping my art career, take off because the projects I did with Jack and Kim really elevated the profile of my work, and I'm most proud of those projects. So it was really lucky, yeah. But that's how it goes.
Yeah, I know you're describing it lucky, but it's interesting the way you're talking about of like you feel this responsibility, being a human, both because you have kids, but also because you're witnessing it. You have this background understanding the science part, but also the art part, and then you're engaging some of the science in Japan, and you have this moment of like clarity where you understand, you see what's kind of coming through, and it almost sounds like the natural world gave you this moment where you were able to realize how you could take on that responsibility and sort of act on it or action it. Because you talk about how your work is using trash collected from the ocean to tell stories of how to protect it. You've had this great moment of inspiration. You have this background that allows you to do it. Now you actually have to go into making the work. Like, how do you get the materials? How do you concept a piece? Like, how does all that come together?
Thanks, Rick. That's a cool question. One of the light bulb moments I had early on as an artist, this is 2007. My professor was trying to get me out of the mindset of just creating utilitarian things. So I grew up making surfboards, and I really just wanted to keep making cool things. And she's like, okay, what if you could make something that told a story? And instantly it all just flipped. And it opened me up to this idea that materials have lives. They have life cycles, and they have memory. And what I try to do is layer meaning and narrative and uh, that I try to bring that history that an object has into its new form. So I collect either old fishing rope off of the beach. Mostly I do that with nonprofit partners who do this type of work all the time. So Sustainable Coastlines Hawaii and the Center for Marine Debris Research, of them are on Oahu. They collect and study materials like this, and when they're done with it, it has to get incinerated on Oahu. There's not much exporting of waste from that island. So I intercept it before it goes to the incinerator, and I store it in a unit in Honolulu. And sometimes I fly home with it. Sometimes I make artwork there. So that's one of my supply chains is making art out of old fishing rope collected off the beach in Hawaii. The other is more local here in Santa Cruz. Basically, fishermen change their ropes regularly, every 2, 3 years, basically, because they need to trust their equipment. If the rope is weak or too old, it'll break. They lose their trap, they lose their catch. It's not worth it to them. So they pay for new rope and they throw the other stuff away. It is often recyclable, but not collected for recycling. There's no infrastructure really up and down the West Coast for rope recycling. That's changing slowly. I can mention some businesses like Net Your Problem, Borreo, Ocean Works that are trying to tap into all that old fishing waste. Huge opportunity there. I just do that in my own subtle way, where I make art out of this insane amount of waste that comes from our local commercial fisheries. And the fishermen feel bad about it. They're like, I wish I didn't have to landfill it, but there's nowhere else for it to go. So there's a huge opportunity there, and I just am trying to highlight that, tell that story of creative reuse with the artwork.
Yeah, another project I wanted to ask you about is one that really struck me. I think it was called For the Waves, and you worked with local student Alex Weber, who had collected 50,000 golf balls from the ocean near Pebble Beach Golf Club. Watching this video of the seals swimming next to the golf balls was honestly like heartbreaking. Like I felt my emotions well, seeing just what felt like the disregard, I think, of people not thinking about the consequences of, like, if they shank a drive off the tee and that golf ball is going to go somewhere, it makes a big splash. Like, where does it end up? So I think you ended up using somewhere around like 20,000 golf balls in this piece, which is beautiful. And like, we'll include a link to it. The show notes, we'll share it on the socials. You're making this piece of art. You're trying to tell this story. At any point, did you just like get really frustrated and be like, what the heck is going on here? Like, what is wrong with us? What is wrong with humans that we're doing this?
Yeah, thanks, man. That's a project I'm really proud of. It was easily one of the hardest projects I've undertaken. I totally underestimated how hard it was going to be to work with golf balls in quantity like that. Yeah, we used about 20,000 of them, and I worked with three local Santa Cruz, UC Santa Cruz students to drill holes in all of them and string them up on this giant frame. So my main frustration was with the difficulty of the project. It was way too ambitious. We got it done. I'm proud of it. I would say it was staggering just knowing that I was only able to use 20,000 of the 50,000 golf balls that my friend Alex Weber collected was just one thing. And the fact that she was only able to collect a subset of the millions of golf balls that are still currently sitting off the coast of Carmel, um, it was kind of put it in perspective, right? And that's the goal of art, is it helps us visualize abstract things like scale, how many golf balls are in the ocean. Um, and so that's what I wanted to make it an immersive experience so people can get up into this giant wave. They can stand there. It's a little cheesy, but I think it also actually is disarming. You get kids go crazy, but so do adults. Everybody wants to get barreled, and you got these like goofy guys who've never surfed before, like experiencing this feeling, and I love that. I don't have too much ego with it. I'm not scared of cheesiness, because I think if it's not fun, people may probably won't connect with it as much. Um, I do like to say that it's not really about golf balls, right? Like, they're just one of the many forms of plastic products that we let go into the ocean, and they sink. And actually, a huge amount of plastics sink. We talk about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, and we see trash washed up on beaches. A lot of it's sitting on the seafloor, outside of river mouths, outside of LA, and major cities. And golf balls are just kind of like a little bit of a conversation starter. It also opens this conversation around point source pollution and non-point source pollution. Basically, city streets, we have litter all over distributed, and it kind of eventually funnels into the ocean through our watersheds. Um, but a point source like a golf course is actually a little more easier to solve, right? Because you can work with that entity to say, hey, either pick up after yourself or implement some kind of different strategy. People talk about nets, but unfortunately, that's not viable for a coastal golf course where you have seabirds and all this stuff. So, as a result of this project that Alex Weber undertook, she got the National Marine Sanctuaries Office, which is part of the federal government, to work with the Pebble Beach Company to sign a memorandum of understanding that they were going to clean up after themselves. So they hired a diver, and this is several years on now. They've been slowly picking up after themselves and being accountable for the fact that they're emitting plastic into a national marine sanctuary, which is illegal. So that's a good outcome. I don't know if it's the perfect solution, but it's progress, and I'm really proud of my friend who just, as a 16-year-old, just got ticked off while she was spearfishing and saw all these golf balls on the seafloor and wanted to do something about it.
Yeah, it's a really incredible story, and I think the way you visualized that and brought it to life, and as you're saying, like, you were able to balance giving people a message, sort of giving them a dose of medicine, while doing it in a way that allowed them to engage with it in a sort of a more fun manner, where it didn't feel like it was accusatory or blaming anyone.
That's a really important balance, and I think that it's the role and maybe the superpower of art in the current moment we're in, and going forward, honestly, which is just that I personally experience a lot of like message fatigue, that I just feel like we hear about these big, dark, scary issues constantly, and they seem so intractable. But if you can break them up and think about them in different ways that are, I don't know, little more disarming and feel more actionable, like more like positive, really. That keeps you going, and I think it keeps the kids going instead of just saying, "Hey, we're inheriting a damaged planet, and there's nothing we can do about it."
Yeah, for sure. I think it's really, I don't know. I saw an interesting quote from Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, who was one of the editors of All We Can Save, and she was talking about Joanna Macy and sort of the difference between hope and optimism, and a lot of it just talking about being able to show up every single day, and like being too optimistic or too hopeful can also be draining, the same way that being overly negative can be. So there definitely has to be some sort of a way to balance, and maybe art is the way through that, of like being able to face the reality of a situation without having to necessarily take on board the most negative aspects 100% of the time.
Yeah, it's definitely more of an open-ended approach. So there are artists who will lean into the doom and gloom, and power to them. That's their approach, and I think it's going to reach certain people. I like to gravitate towards more positive or uplifting or aspirational messaging because I do think there's far too much of the doom and gloom out there. There's a background element there too, where oftentimes certain types of messaging and environmentalist messages only hits a certain audience or is targeted towards a certain audience. And art has this kind of really cool leveling of the playing field ability where by age or by background, you're just going to take from the artwork what you will. I'm not trying to impose a message always to the audience, right? Like it's really I'm always shocked at how people take what I've made and think about it in a way that's totally different from what how I was thinking about it. And that's what it is. It's a critical thinking generator that draws upon personal experiences that everybody has, and then that starts a conversation. And I think that's my theory of change, is that if you can start that dialogue internally or between, say, an artist and somebody who's experiencing my art, that's where you can trigger some potential behavior changes, lifestyle changes, and that can have ripple effects. So that's my personal aspirational approach to it.
I've been really lucky over the course of the podcast. I've gotten to talk to a lot of activists and surfers and scientists, a lot of people with ocean connections. And there definitely seems to be something about people who surf in particular, who have a deep affinity. Not all surfers. I forgot, one of my guests was quick to point out that there are a lot of terrible surfers, but
Yeah.
a good majority of them seem to be very engaged. And you had this one quote, like, essentially that we treat the ocean both as humanity's waste bin and our fast food joint, which is really interesting way to look at it in terms of what we put in it, but also what we take out of it. And we simply dump too many pollutants into it, you talked about, while extracting too many organisms and resources out of it. So I think there's a challenge where people can see, giant redwoods in Northern California. They can see polar bears on a shard of a glacier. Like, there's this bit of ocean blindness that I think a lot of our guests have brought up. How do you think about that as someone who's deeply connected to the ocean? And is art one way to visualize that and like make it feel real for people when they can't necessarily see below the surface?
Yes, definitely. That's art's superpower, is to make visual and tangible that which is occurring offshore, underwater, out of sight, out of mind. It's a privilege to be somebody who regularly goes into the ocean and sees things changing. Uh, and I guess my mentality is shifting a lot recently. I think my personal view now of the way forward is to really connect people to sustainable food systems. And I know fishing is one of those topics that gets people really fired up. But I'm really trying to advocate more for like local sustainable fisheries, because if we don't support those, then we're just continuing to import from unregulated foreign fisheries. And so I think going out and catching a fish, following the rules, doing it responsibly is one of the simple, most radical acts that you can have to like connect yourself to the environment, to the ocean, because that is the fruit of conservation, right? If we have basic rules for size and season and people follow them, then all of a sudden we get to have our fish and eat it too. So that's been something I've been really trying to advocate for. And it's part of my upbringing, right? Is like growing up fishing in Santa Cruz and surfing. Like surfers have this kind of non-extractive relationship. They're basically nature watchers floating around. They like to think they're cool, but they're really just dorks. We are dorks bobbing around like seals. And I love that about it. It's actually one of the goofiest things. Grown men floating around in rubber suits, like skin tight rubber suits, trying to be super macho. I think surfing is very silly and esoteric in the way that people overhype it to be this thing about personal competition is very interesting. It's also super badass to get people, like doing incredible things. So there's a spectrum. Um, but I think fishing is one of those things where it's like, no, it's a really just a clear connection. Like this is where you eat. Don't poop where you eat. Don't don't take too much, or there won't be more for you or the next guy. It's a lot more grounded, and I'm trying to advocate for people to think about it that way instead of just superimposing all the really terrible stuff that happens in international waters onto local sustainable fisheries. They're just completely different things. There's a really good book called The Outlaw Ocean if people want to dive into essentially why we shouldn't be eating imported seafood or cheap imported seafood. Um, and yeah, I just think that's one of the angles of how I think about things these days is, the organic movement has had a lot of success. And I think sustainable seafood is really the next level to responsible consumerism.
Totally. 100% agree. So I think what's really interesting about our conversation and just sort of bring it to a close is you've talked about uh, the responsibility that you feel being a human in these various ecosystems. You've talked about the privilege of being able to be in these spaces. You're creating art out of your experience of this and your engagement with this. For a lot of people who maybe get a little bit beaten down by this, maybe get too caught up in the negative, and miss that space of opportunity to connect in a way that is more positive or more at a deeper level than just the statistics. Like, what advice do you have? Like, how do you keep? I don't want to say how do you stay optimistic or hopeful, but like, how do you keep going in a way that you have this connection and you want to maintain it and you want to see other people have this connection? How do you keep going?
I think that one way I would run with that is that most people are working jobs that they don't really like. It's just a job, and I get that. We all have to make a paycheck. It's part of life, but I urge people to, if they can slowly, gently nourish their other passion, the thing that they really want to be doing over time, and grow towards that. Either, I always say, don't quit your day job. Don't jump straight into becoming an environmental artist if that's what you really want to do. Slowly try to transition between them and, use your current job to help leverage you to get to where you want to be. The Japanese expression of ikigai is, I think, one of the most grounding and powerful frameworks. It's this tension between what you're good at, what the world needs, what you can get paid for, and what you love. Hopefully, I got that right. And it roughly translates to reason for being. And I kind of believe that if everybody was able to find that sweet spot where you're doing what the world needs, but you're also doing what you need, that there's a way forward there where people are going to be more fulfilled and we won't be messing up our home planet as much potentially. So that's, I'm lucky to have found that path. Like I said before, it's not a straight line. Any given day, I might just be trying to pay the rent, or I might just be, going crazy painting just for me, so that there's this spectrum and it changes day to day. But I would say, Sylvia Earle is like, the grandmother, her deepness of ocean conservation. Her whole thing is just do what you love. And Carl Safina told me that to my face when I was 19 years old. And it totally, hearing it from him was like, okay, I just need to do what I love. And everything falls into place from there, personally, and I think societally.
Oh, that's a beautiful way to wrap the conversation. Thanks so much, Ethan, for joining us today. I'm really excited to get this out to folks to listen to.
Thank you, Rick. Great questions. That it was super fun talking with you.